Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through the sources, the noise, to help you really get what's going on. And lately, wow, you really can't miss the headlines about these pretty intense clashes between federal power and state power.
No, you really can't. It feels like it's everywhere. We're seeing these high-stakes showdowns pop up constantly.
Yeah, from state borders, think Texas, to boardroom regulations, even down to your own wallet.
Exactly. I mean, look at Texas right now, openly defying the Justice Department on immigration measures. You've got the razor wire fencing, those floating barriers in the Rio Grande.
Right, the barriers.
And Alabama, too, basically ignoring a Supreme Court ruling on redistricting. These aren't just, isolated incidents.
Seems like part of something bigger.
It does. It feels like a larger strategy. And it's not just legal stuff. It's bleeding into the economic side, too. We've seen this whole national conversation erupt around politicized or maybe unlawful debanking.
Debanking, right.
Yeah.
That led to President Trump's executive order just recently, August 7th, didn't it? Aimed right at that issue.
Precisely. The order, guaranteeing fair banking for all Americans, is meant to counter that very practice.
So these events, they feel like more than just political back and forth.
Oh, definitely. They point to a much deeper struggle, really, over who actually holds the reins of power in America.
And how that power affects individual freedoms, how it affects your business, your economic future. It's all connected.
So it makes you wonder, what if the government closest to you, your state government, truly held most of the power instead of, some distant federal agency in D.C.?
That's the big question we're diving into today.
Yeah, today our deep dive is going to unpack sources like policy analyses from the Heritage Foundation. We've got Senate hearing transcripts on judicial power.
We even looked at discussions on Reddit, trying to get a sense of the public pulse on this.
Right. And our mission really is to pull out the key insights. How is all this political polarization fundamentally reshaping that balance of power between Washington and the states?
And crucially, what does this rebalancing mean for your everyday life, your wallet, and your liberty?
So let's start with the states themselves. When we look at these clashes, what's the strategy? Is there a central goal driving these moves, especially from the conservative states?
Yeah, what's the big picture here?
There absolutely is. Our sources show a really strong, pretty organized push from, politically conservative or red states to, decentralized power.
Decentralized, meaning?
Meaning they want to dial back the reach of federal agencies that many conservatives feel have gotten way too big, too intrusive. Think EPA, OSHA, even the FDA.
Okay.
The argument you hear, and it's in the Heritage analyses, for instance, is that this brings accountability closer to the people. It's framed as aligning with what the Founding Fathers originally intended. A smaller federal government with states handling most day-to-day issues.
Accountability closer to home.
Yeah.
That makes intuitive sense. But for you listening, what does this state defiance actually look like on the ground? Got some examples?
Oh, plenty. And they're making headlines. Take Texas Governor Greg Abbott. He's not just talking. He's actively defied the Justice Department on immigration.
We mentioned the razor wire, the barriers.
Right. Plus arresting migrants directly, sending busloads of asylum seekers to other states, actions that predictably have led to lawsuits from the DOJ.
Okay, Texas is one. Any others?
Yeah, look at Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill allowing the death penalty for child rape. Now, that directly challenges a 2008 Supreme Court ruling.
And his whole campaign theme, I Said No to Washington, kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
It really does. It captures that spirit perfectly. And then you've got Alabama, Governor Kay Ivey signing a redistricting map that, effectively ignored a Supreme Court order about creating a second black majority district.
Wow. So it's not just symbolic pushback?
Not at all. And what's fascinating, as you mentioned, is how this defiance is often seen as, frankly, good politics.
Right. It energizes the base.
Exactly. It appeals strongly to a conservative base,
Right.
and it reflects this broader trend we're seeing where state parties are taking more assertive, sometimes you could say extreme stances against the federal government.
So the bottom line for you, the listener, is that these shifts could mean the rules you live or work under might look really different depending on which side of a state line you're on.
Absolutely.
Right.
Environmental standards, worker safety rules, all potentially varying significantly state by state.
This dynamic, states asserting their independence, it must have some serious economic ripple effects, right?
Oh, definitely.
I mean, if you're a business trying to operate across the country, juggling potentially 50 different sets of rules, Sounds like a nightmare.
It's a huge complication. Think about it from a business perspective.
Yeah.
Imagine you're making cars, say, in Michigan. It used to be maybe minor differences state to state.
Right.
Now, you might need fundamentally different engine setups, maybe entirely separate production lines for cars sold in California versus those sold in, say, Texas.
Yeah.
Just because their emissions standards are diverging so much.
That sounds incredibly inefficient.
It is. Our sources, particularly those looking at the economic impact, talk about this regulatory balkanization. It's seen as a major drag, driving up costs, maybe even stifling innovation.
And this inefficiency, this regulatory burden, that connects directly to supply-side economics, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a core argument for supply-side advocates.
Now, most of our listeners probably know the basics of supply-side low taxes, less regulation equals growth. But what are our sources saying about its relevance today in this really polarized climate?
Well, it's become more than just an economic prescription. It's framed now as a deep critique of the modern administrative state. The core ideas are the same: low taxes, less red tape to boost growth. But proponents now are increasingly linking excessive regulation and government spending directly to what they often term woke policies or identity politics.
So it's an economic argument intertwined with a cultural one.
Kind of, yeah. The argument is that these kinds of government interventions aren't just economically inefficient. They believe they actively undermine economic freedom and encourage dependency. The core belief remains: unleash the private sector from these burdens and you'll unlock prosperity.
Okay, so where do they point for proof? Do the sources cite historical examples where this approach worked?
They do. They often point to several periods: the Roaring '20s, 1922 to 29, the mid-'60s boom, 62 to 68, and that long expansion from about 1982 up to 2000.
Okay.
And more recently, they'd cite what they call a mini boomlet during part of the Trump presidency, particularly after the tax cuts and some regulatory rollbacks went into effect. The common thread, they argue, is a reduction in the tax wedge.
Tax wedge. Let's unpack that a bit. How do high taxes create this disincentive for, working or investing?
Okay, think of it like this. You've got your federal income tax top rate, 37%. Then add Medicare taxes. Then add state and local taxes.
Right, which can be really high in some places.
Exactly. In some blue states, your total marginal tax rate could easily push past 40%, maybe even 50%. That high rate acts like a wedge.
A wedge between
the effort you put in working, investing, taking risks, and the reward you actually get to keep. The argument is, if that wedge is too big, people might say, why bother? They might choose more leisure time instead of working that extra hour. Or they might put more effort into finding tax shelters rather than investing in productive businesses. Capital might even avoid entering those high tax areas altogether.
So it's about incentives.
Fundamentally, yes. It's about how taxes affect the incentive to produce and invest.
And what about the cost of the regulations themselves? Not just taxes, but the rules. Do our sources put a number on that?
They do, and it's pretty eye-popping. There's an estimate cited from Wayne Cruz at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Back in 2012, he calculated the cost of federal regulations alone at over $1.8 trillion.
Trillion, with a T.
With a T, yeah. Which broke down at the time to something like $14,768 per household.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And from that perspective, cutting regulations isn't just a side issue. It's seen as just as crucial as cutting taxes for boosting the economy.
So for you listening, the question becomes, how could lower taxes and fewer regulations potentially change things in your community, your job prospects, the price of goods? It hits close to home.
Definitely. And speaking of regulations reaching into our lives, this whole debanking controversy seems like a flashpoint, doesn't it? It really highlights that tension between oversight and freedom.
It does. So first off, what exactly is debanking as it's being discussed here?
Okay, so debanking in this context means denying financial services like bank accounts, loans, payment processing to people or businesses. But crucially, it's not based on normal financial risk, like, having bad credit or a history of bouncing checks.
Right.
It's allegedly based on their political views, who they associate with, or maybe beliefs that are constitutionally protected. So you're cut off not because you're a financial risk, but because someone doesn't like your politics or your industry.
And our sources, particularly from the conservative side, claim this is happening. Who do they say is being targeted?
The allegations are that it's used against industries that are, let's say, out of favor with certain political groups. Firearms dealers, fossil fuel companies are often mentioned.
Okay.
But it's also claimed to extend to individuals or groups linked with conservative causes. Think people supporting Trump, or MAGA, or even reports mentioned just shopping at places like Cabela's or Bass Pro Shop potentially triggering flags.
Shopping at Bass Pro Shop, really?
That's what some of the allegations cited in the sources suggest, yeah. That
Yeah.
certain transactions were being flagged. They see it as a form of financial censorship, basically.
Now, Operation Choke Point often comes up in this context. That was under the Obama-Biden administration. Remind us what that was.
Right, Operation Choke Point. Critics argue that the Justice Department essentially pressured banks to cut ties with certain legal but politically unpopular industries by citing reputational risks.
Reputational risk.
Yeah, a vague term. And a House committee report back in 2014 actually found the operation lacked, quote, adequate legal authority. The concern now, voiced in these sources, is that this kind of debanking has been turbocharged under the current Biden administration, with claims of banks flagging customer transactions linked to Trump or MAGA in things like peer-to-peer payments.
Which raises huge questions about privacy and bias in banking.
Exactly. And that's the backdrop for President Trump's executive order on August 7th, guaranteeing fair banking for all Americans.
So what does that order actually do? What are its main directives?
Okay, the core mandate is that banking decisions must be based only on individualized, objective, and risk-based analyses, period. No political preferences, no social scoring allowed.
Just the financial facts.
Supposedly, yes. It also explicitly tells federal banking regulators to scrub the term reputation risk from their internal guidance documents within 6 months.
Getting rid of that vague justification.
Right. And maybe most significantly, it orders audits of banks to look for past unlawful debanking policies. If they find violations, there could be remedial actions or even referrals for civil lawsuits.
So, real teeth, potentially.
That's the intent. Groups like the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action, for instance, called the order a good step towards stopping, quote, inappropriate use of federal oversight powers, unjustified financial industry blacklists, and woke banking.
This really makes you think, doesn't it? For you, the listener, how does this idea of financial institutions potentially making decisions based on politics, how does that affect your trust in the system, your own access?
It's a fundamental question, and that leads us neatly into another really crucial area, how laws themselves get interpreted, especially by federal agencies. We need to talk about something called Chevron deference. For anyone following legal debates, especially at the Supreme Court level lately, this is a huge deal.
Chevron deference. Okay, break that down for us. What is it, and why is it such a flashpoint, particularly for conservatives?
So, Chevron comes from a 1984 Supreme Court case, Chevron USA versus Natural Resources Defense Council. Basically, it established this doctrine if Congress writes a law, and a part of that law is ambiguous or unclear.
Which happens a lot, right? Laws can be complex.
Exactly. If the statute is ambiguous and the agency responsible for administering that law, like the EPA for environmental laws, comes up with an interpretation, the courts should generally defer to that agency's interpretation as long as it's considered reasonable.
Okay, so the courts step back and say, agency, you're the expert here, your reasonable take stands.
Pretty much. And that's where the controversy explodes for conservative critics. They argue Chevron deference gives federal agencies a massive amount of power, essentially a blank check, they say, to interpret laws in ways Congress maybe never intended.
A blank check.
Yeah, allowing agencies, in effect, to legislate with little accountability. And there's data to back up the awareness. One study found something like 94% of federal regulators knew about Chevron deference by name.
94%. Wow, so they know this tool exists.
Critics argue they absolutely know, and it incentivizes them to push the envelope, to make aggressive interpretations of laws, to expand their own power and advance their policy agendas.
Can you give an example of an agency supposedly pushing those boundaries using Chevron? And how does that blur those constitutional lines between Congress making laws and courts interpreting them?
A classic example often cited is the EPA's interpretation of the Clean Water Act, specifically defining waters of the United States, or WOTUS.
Right, WOTUS has been controversial for years.
Hugely. Critics argued the EPA used deference to expand its jurisdiction far beyond what Congress originally envisioned, covering ditches, ponds, things that seemed far removed from navigable waters. This blurring of lines is the core constitutional concern. Critics say it undermines the separation of powers. Article 1 gives Congress the power to legislate. Article 3 gives the judiciary the power to interpret laws. Chevron, they argue, lets the executive branch agencies do both, creating this powerful administrative state.
And there's a practical impact too, right? Agencies can issue rules, businesses might have to comply immediately.
Exactly. Even before the courts can fully review the rule. There was a quote from an EPA administrator about the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards Rule, the MATIS rule. She basically noted that by the time the Supreme Court might eventually rule on it, quote, the investments have been made.
So compliance happens regardless of the final legal outcome, just because of the delay and cost.
That's the dynamic critics point to. The agency pushes its agenda, knowing compliance costs might make later court victories almost irrelevant for the regulated businesses.
Does the gridlock we see in Congress play into this? Are they sort of enabling this by writing vague laws in the first place?
That's a huge part of the argument. Many observers say yes, absolutely. Congress is often gridlocked, unable to agree on detailed legislation for complex problems.
So they pass something broad.
Right. They delegate enormous authority to the agencies, essentially saying, you figure out the details. Critics call this passing the buck. It forces agencies, and then potentially courts dealing with Chevron, to fill in the gaps, further empowering that administrative state.
Which brings it back to you, the listener. Is this administrative state acting like an unaccountable fourth branch of government, making rules that affect your life, your work, without direct approval from the people you elected?
It's a fundamental question about modern governance.
So wrapping this up, what we've really unpacked today is this profound, deepening tension, isn't it, between federal power and state power.
Yeah, it's a fundamental debate playing out everywhere. Centralized control versus decentralized governance. And it's not abstract. It directly impacts economic policy, how regulations are made and enforced, even how our basic laws are understood.
And our sources across the board really point to this growing blue versus red state divide, this polarization. Some observers are even using the word balkanization, warning that the U.S. could become more fragmented.
It's a serious concern being raised.
So the final thought for you to ponder. Given this deep division, this erosion of faith in maybe some central institutions, can America still find a path forward? Can we maintain, ordered liberty and adapt within a diverse society?
Or are we heading towards a future that looks, well, a lot more fragmented?
That's the big question hanging in the air. Something for all of us to think about.